started. For those of you who don't know and who weren't sitting close to me in the back yesterday, the University of Minnesota has a meat lab, if you did not know this. And they were the first university to have a meat lab in the United States. And Tim, what year?
1901.
1901 was the first time they had the meat lab. So Andrew Voss is the gentleman who started it, who was the professor who started it. And the meat lab is named after him now. So we're very fortunate. The meat lab is a great partner to the Minnesota Beef Council. They go out and do cutting demos all the time for me. So we appreciate this. This is Dr. Ryan Cox. He heads the meat lab. And so he's been here 10 years? 10 years. He and I came to Minnesota about the same time. So he's been up here 10 years. And I just learned this today that he took the job up here because his skill set and the job description matched perfectly, and so that's why he took the job in Minnesota. So we're very grateful to have him because we didn't have much of a meat science program, and thanks to him, we're a little bit more on the map now. So, so his job, his extension, is to go out and educate people when it comes to beef. Next to him is Tristan McNamara. Tristan is his right hand and runs the meat lab for Ryan. So, and if you're in the cities, they also have a meat sales room that's open on Wednesdays from 2 to 5. 5? Is that right? And they sell a lot of product. And over here we have one of Ryan's grad students, Jason. And so welcome to them. Ask them any questions. They all are experts when it comes to meat. So ask any and all questions you want. So I'll let you start, Brian.
Very flattering. Very nice. Thank you. We just like to cut meat. A little bit of our program, if you've not heard of meat science, it seems a little bit to the public, a little bit strange. But we are just a reflection of modern agriculture. We're evaluating what we're doing in modern agriculture, its effects on the product, ways that we can enhance the quality, the safety, the efficiency of the product, etc. Very in line with the nutrition work we do, the genetics work we do on campus, etc. So there's nothing really very controversial about what we do. People sort of think of us putting strange chemicals and things in the meat and trying that out. And the reality is we're just looking at how modern diets affect quality of beef, for example, or pork. Some safety interventions that we can take to make things safer, etc. We at the university are basically paid to make the mistakes so that the industry does not. And so that's kind of how we see it as well. A big part of what we do in Extension is coming out and doing this, and we really appreciate you having us for this. We were tasked with cutting beef, and quite honestly, we cut a whole lot of rolls and a whole lot of strips. And so I was sort of interested to see if you were interested in learning or talking a little bit more about the chuck. I think there's a lot of opportunity there. Very clearly, we know we have some value cuts from a number of years ago that we still have at our utility and can use, and so I wanted to discuss that. So right off the bat, so what we're going to be doing is we're going to be looking at a shoulder clod, okay, so the chuck clod, and then we're also going to be looking at the roll. So if we're orienting ourselves, I'll use your sheet here, so sort of orient you. Obviously you're up here at the chuck, and I don't want to get too basic for the group, but more specifically, the chuck, no kidding, that's the front shoulder, right? But more specifically, when we talk about the clod, we're talking about muscles that are associated with the front leg. Okay, so when we say clod, it's a muscle grouping, and what we have to remember about cattle in general, they're four-legged animals, they're walking around on four legs, but their front legs are not connected by bone to the rest of their body. Okay, you remember your blade bone floats in muscle. It's held in place by muscle, and that blade bone connects to the arm bone, or what would be the front leg bone. So those muscles are essentially responsible for holding up the weight of the front of the animal, its head and everything. And so you'll notice those fibers here, they're a little more coarse. They take on a brighter red color than what you'd find in the round, for example, where it's going to be leaner, a little bit finer texture, a little bit lighter red color. Okay, so right away we know those are some differences, and that's kind of lending itself into discussion as to why we break out in a clod and a roll. Okay, and so the first answer is number one, cattle are big, and we need to start getting it smaller. But we typically try to isolate by tenderness. That's how we're segregating carcasses. And we know that in the chuck we do have that tenderness challenge. However, we have some bone restrictions and constrictions in place that help us to get a very tender set of muscles, like the flat iron, that we can retail, that muscle being the second most tender in the carcass. So there's a lot of opportunity there as well. So we're going to start, and we had a little discussion before we got started where we want to start. I think we're going to start with the clod. So if I can paint you a picture of what a clod is, if you think about an animal on four legs, okay, the blade bone essentially is at an angle. The blade bone is a paddle, okay? So if it was an facing that direction, the paddle would be pointed at sort of a 45-degree angle, maybe a little sharper. Okay, and that paddle bone connects to the leg bone that goes to the front leg. Okay, so this is a superficial type of bone. It's not completely snugged up against the spine. And on top of that, it's got some muscles, but it has a ridge on it. So it's a big paddle, but it's got a ridge. Okay, and if I were to take a cross-section of that, it would look kind of like a T. Or further up, it looks like a 7. That's where we get the phrase 7-bone roast. Okay, when I take a cross-section of that bone, that's the 7th bone. Okay, so you've got a flat paddle and then a ridge sitting on it. And the clod, a wholesale clod, is going to be taking the muscles that are on this side of the paddle and the associated muscles over here. Okay, and we leave this side over here separate. And so, with that said, we orient you here to those muscles. You can see here, Tristan's got in his hand, this would be the muscle that would be sitting directly on top of that blade bone. Okay, this muscle is called the infraspinatus muscle, if you really want to know that fun name. Okay, so there would be a ridge here, a bone ridge, and then there would be another muscle sitting here, would be the supraspinatus, but to us we call it mock tender, or a petite tender, a beef petite tender or mock tender. The language here is a petite tender. It's smaller than a tenderloin, and that's how it gets its phrase petite. Tender because it takes the general shape of the tenderloin, but it is certainly not like a tenderloin, and it is not as tender. It's an excellent opportunity, though, for things like medallions, where you're going to be cutting smaller, overcoming your tenderness issue by shortening the fiber length, etc., with your cutting. So that's what we'd have here. So what we're looking at here on the top of the tail, this is the inside of the animal, and then effectively you got your hard fat on the outside. Okay, so you can access these muscles right here in the clod from a hanging carcass. Okay, and that's a bit of a discussion when we talk about how these are fabricated. Currently, we know that clods are pulled off on the line, and they're sold wholesale as clods. However, there's an opportunity to go superficially. You can pull out, say, just the flat iron off of a carcass without actually fabbing just this. So, an important opportunity there as well to think about. Obviously, we know that's a labor cost that's associated with that, a change in what we're looking at, because then we're not looking at roast here, but that's the first separation we'll make. So this muscle, again, sitting on top of bone, and then this one floating out. Okay, so it's essentially floating out, getting away from the muscles that are right on the bone and getting under kind of right here. Okay, so let's go ahead and Tristan's gonna be our hands because he cuts a lot more than I do on a daily basis. He's better at it. And he's gonna separate out just that muscle, that infraspinatus muscle. Okay, well, commonly some language that we use associated with the clod, because we know that scapula is there, and these muscles are benefiting from that scapula, meaning if the bone is there, that means they're doing a little bit less work in order to hold that weight, because they've got bone restriction. So a lot of these are called blades. So you'll talk about a blade steak or a blade roast, commonly, that type of nomenclature. So he's taking out just that muscle, and it comes out, and very, very quickly it becomes evident that this could potentially be fairly marbled. So you can see the silver skin that would be associated where it was separated away from the bone itself. So there is silver skin that sits, the connective tissue that sits between the bone and the muscle. So he's going to come in here and clean up silver skin first to expose just the muscle. Notes about silver skin in general. This is a tissue, this is a connective tissue that does nothing for contraction. It has no function in color, it's there for structure only. And any protein that is in meat for structure is there for toughness for us. Okay, it doesn't serve any other purpose than to be tough, and it's doing its job in the living system. But when you pull away that silver skin and that connective tissue, and you look at the lean under it, you can see how very marbled this cut is. It becomes very evident that we've got sort of a jewel, diamond in the rough here. You've got a spot where there's a lot of action, a lot of activity, a lot of connective tissue, quite honestly. He just pulled one layer of connective tissue off the inside where the bone was. Now he's going to come on the outside, the superficial side, the exterior, and in an attempt to pull off the fat, you're also taking off another layer of connective tissue. So here are some challenges that we have, and those that are marketing flat irons right now, smaller markets having a hard time saying that they even cut them, because they don't. Because he's taken 2 layers of connective tissue off right away. And commonly, if you were to cut them in cross section, so the old way of thinking right now is Tristan would take his knife and he would go perpendicular to the length of the muscle, and he would cut what we would call top blade steaks. Okay, and those top blade steaks, if you'll remember, are going to be sort of an oval, and they're going to have a strip of white in the middle of them. That strip of white in the middle is that connective tissue, very hard connective tissue, sinew, whatever you would like to call it. So that was a challenge. the neat thing about that connective tissue is it's carrying most of the weight load for the muscle. So the muscle around it is incredibly tender. This is the second most tender muscle in the carcass. And it's hidden in the chuck because it has so much help. So if we're not going in sort of that traditional methodology, and again, if I'm in value add and I'm in the business of value add, I see an opportunity right here, right away. If I look at a brisket, I see the same thing. There's lots of flavor laced in there. Okay, so we know that we can get around that. This is a muscle. Generally speaking, muscles, we take the fiber, they go the length of the muscle rather. And so if we can get rid of that, then we have an opportunity. So that's what we're doing now. Instead of cutting those as top blade steaks, or that would be a top blade roast technically, it's on top of the blade, it's a top blade roast. He's going to come in here and he's going to expose, maybe you can turn that so they can see that. He's going to expose that strip. It's like a bootstrap almost. It's a strip of connective tissue that he can get on top of. So this starts to look like he's filleting a fish. Right? When you think about getting down, you get that hard flex on those knives. We don't want that kind of flex, but he's trying to do that. He's essentially trying to fillet a fish. So he's trying to pull away the meat from this strap right here. That strap's that's doing all the way, because right here, this is all lean. So essentially you have two tubes of muscle with a strap laying in the middle of it. So that's our business here. And right here, you'll start to see why there is some pushback in cutting these, right? Because there's a fair amount of skill, time, and trim loss in doing this. When we go to getting rid of, say, some of the trim, but also really going in and getting that connective tissue strip out. But it's a nice guide, and as you get better at it, he cuts them a lot cleaner than I do. You'll start to learn that one side is going to be weighted a little bit heavier than the other side. And I think that's another challenge that we have with flat irons is, you know, we're going in, we're trimming down to get one side of a muscle. He's still got the strip of connective tissue in there. And so if you look, he's got a really nice strip here for a nice thickness, untraditional thickness of a steak. And we'll get to that here in a minute. Okay, so that's fairly decent. But then he's going to come in and take off the other side, which means the other side is going to be a little thinner. And so that disparity also sort of plays into maybe the pushback we're seeing, where we don't see the flat iron as commonplace as we could. We're seeing it a lot in wholesale, a lot in restaurants, less in retail, I think, generally. And this is just anecdotal from myself to say that. But again, if you see, you got the heavy side and the thin side, or the light side of that. And these can be trimmed down further, not particularly. When you're talking about retail, this is where we're going. As far as the primal, but now you have to think about this. When I go in, and he's got the connective tissue strip, one thing we like to do on campus, if we get a chance, or we can even do it here if you want to, because we're nerds, I get a ruler out, and I measure how long this is, and we can do that. We take this chunk off. We can measure this, and we just throw it on any hot top and cook it real fast and dry, and this will shrink down to maybe a third of its size. And we try to tell that to consumers, say, imagine now if you're cooking that in the cut. Okay, and you think about steaks or burgers that curl up in cup, okay, or pepperoni on a pizza that curls up in cups because it has too much of that connective tissue that doesn't do anything only for structure. So those shrink very quickly when they're heated fast. They turn into gelatin if we heat them slow, but that's not typical for a steak. So that's obviously something that needs to come out. But in traditional cutting, if you look at the length of an animal, generally speaking, and this is a generic rule, the fibers run the length of the animal. And so if I take, say, the rib section or the loin section out, I'm effectively taking the top loin muscle, which is a tube of muscle. I'm oversimplifying this. And I know that tube, within that tube, the fibers are running the length of the tube. Okay? So if I'm trying to make it as tender as possible, I go immediately perpendicular to the length. Okay? So that's giving me the most tender possible geometry. Right? Because if I cut with the fiber, if you think about it, they're biting through every single fiber, whereas cutting against the fiber, then you're biting between fibers. But we have a challenge here because this muscle runs the other way. And so with flat iron steaks, you're actually cutting them with their fiber on the plate is going to be running across the plate as opposed to up and down on the plate. And that's a challenge, I think, for maybe some fabrication, but in reality, it eats very well. It's a very, very good eating steak. So this would be your sort of larger flat iron steak. You can go to a 2 or 3 steaks generally, I think, with the flat iron. This is obviously the larger portion, but a very nice, highly marbled steak here. And it can be trimmed down a little further, but again, a really nice marbled steak. The flat iron, I think, is probably the most successful of the value-added cuts that were demonstrated number of years back by NCBA and all the universities. Great cut, very versatile, probably one of my favorite. You can do virtually anything with it, and I think all of you can see that and know that with your products. But again, you're faced with a pretty decent challenge here, because what was a 7-bone roast that was easy to cut, it was very little loss, right? You're taking essentially and taking everything with it, or even if you're going with a boneless roast, which we'll get to, your yield is much higher. Here there's a lot of loss, there's a lot of time commitment, and you are breaking up more traditional cuts. So if you are cutting a flat iron, then you're not necessarily going to be cutting that type of roast, a blade roast, per se, with the bone. Follow? Any questions on that? I put this one, we opened this one first, and I sort of blocked, because this happens a lot in packing. Okay, you get this large scour here. Okay, and so when they're trying to work around the arm bone and the blade bone, very often they'll scour this section, because traditional packing plants don't assume that you're cutting flat irons, and so they won't prioritize this geometry here. If they know that that's a priority, then we might protect this a little better, but very commonly this gets scored like this. And when you do that, you can see the connective tissue and all that, but for less confusion, we wanted to go a little bit more intact. This is a little more finish on it as well. And so you're left here, if you're kind of used to traditional cutting, and you remember the old gooseneck, okay, if you remember that heel, where the heel comes off on the gooseneck, you've got that type of seam here, which is fairly telling, sort of a premonition to the fact that we're going to start getting into tougher stuff, just like in the shank. Getting away from that protection, that bone that was giving us a lot of structure, and not making the muscle do a whole lot of work, as well as that connective tissue. We're getting away from that now. These are just sort of in space, as NFL announcers like to say now, receivers in space. These muscles are out, okay, and they're doing a lot of work because they don't have a whole lot of support with them. And so we're going to start sort of pulling off some of the boneless roasts that are associated with this cut, and I was asked to kind of make reference to some of these. So I've made reference already to the petite tender that would be on the other side of that flat iron. Okay, so it's a smaller cut on the other side of that ridge, which we don't have here because it's the clod, it's a boneless clod. We've done the top blade. We've had a discussion of that. We know that the top blade, steak or whole roast, is a possibility. And then sort of your roast, and I'm just looking to see which ones we can kind of touch on here. The leaner of the roast is going to be your Sierra, from my recollection. We're not there yet. Yeah, the ranch. So we've got a lean ranch, and essentially these are all boneless blade roasts, because we're cutting the direction that we normally would have in a bone-in roast, meaning we're going perpendicular to the length of the animal. Okay, so the old traditional way of cutting chuck roast was just to continue here and just start cutting this direction, slices this direction, and cutting, because we're cutting generally across the grain. Okay, but we know that this is complex sort of geometry up here in the front of the animal, so at a certain point when you get up so far, you're going to start making cuts this direction, okay, coming up from those front legs, okay? And those we typically refer to as arm roasts. Even though cattle don't have arms, we call them arm roasts because it's the front leg. Okay, so depending on the geometry, the directionality of how you cut these will sort of dictate. Generally in the clod, we don't refer to them as often as arm roasts, because you're not getting that low. You're not forced down into that lower area. So you're looking for this leaner section here. It's sort of under and beside the blade is the best way to describe it, the serratus muscle. And you can see that there. These are the ones that we want to cut across the grain as a roast. It's our preference, sort of an older methodology, is to leave some fat on these things for flavor. It's not as much of a concern in the chuck, because we generally have a little bit more fat within the primal chuck than we would in the round, but we still like to leave a layer of fat, basically for the customer to decide. You've got the roast there. We typically cut these down to say 1.5 pound to 2 pound roasts, and those will take, you know, depending on how that's marketed, they could take several shapes, because if you're looking how we're defining a roast, and it depends on your SKU, but we're looking at above 1.5 inches to 2 inches thick. So you have a nice roast there. So your shoulder roast here on your sheet, if you still have that, is this guy here. I'm trying to parallel it to the sheet as well as I can to kind of give you an idea. But again, and just kind of noting and geeking out a little bit back on the science thing, generally, a steer or heifer deposits fat as it grows and gets older from the front of the animal back. Okay, so the chuck is where we start to put that fat between the muscles and within the muscles, and then as the animal ages, we put more and more fat towards the back for several reasons. Number one, the heart is up front, it needs that fat. for heat and for power and circulation in general. So we know that we can balance a little bit. We have to be mindful of the fact that this will be tougher. It's got a coarser fiber, but we do have some flavor advantages up here that are going to insulate and help us keep that product juicy. Okay, so where you would have the flat iron or the blade steak, you have the blade roast or boneless chuck roast would be the best, most descriptive way of saying what we have here. And you can cut those into a couple of roasts if you like. Any questions on that guy? The Clod now is fairly straightforward. We're really looking, with a Clod, you've got two general portions of a Clod, what we used to call a butcher's glove cut. We don't have as many associated, what I'm seeing, at least anecdotally, as many associated muscles anymore. We're cutting them a little trimmer now and making sort of your traditional roasts out of this portion here. Questions, thoughts, insults, complaints? Okay, then we will set this one aside. We'll move to the roll. So other things we've been doing, maybe as a transition, before we get into that, we're trying to rethink this in many different ways, and I don't need to tell you that if I can get more money out of a cut, that means I can charge less for the other stuff. That's general economics. That's adding value to the carcass. So we do that in a number of ways. We don't have it here, but the general trend with the middle meats now is looking at surface area, and you may or may not be aware of this, but when we're looking to alternatively merchandise beef now, it's a large response to the fact that we're growing cattle larger. Okay, so in 1965, a market weight steer would be, how heavy do you think? 900. Yeah, 900 to 1,000. And that's what we based our yield grades on, and our yield grade equations and all that. If you know a lot about statistics and the tail ends of those bell curves, we're kind of out on those tails now. But we were looking at, a 1,000-pound animal today. Market weight going into a packing plant is very close to 1,400 pounds. So with a larger animal, great for the industry. They're putting more protein per animal unit. The packing plant does really well, but what we have to do is resolve that surface area because we know we're portioned and we know that we are our weight. So if you're trying to sell 4, 6, 8 ounce portion and you've got an increased surface area, what do you have to do? You have to cut it thinner. When you cut that product thinner, it typically gets overcooked. Okay, so you're sort of not helping yourself by cutting it thinner and insulating against a flaw or a defect. And so now, say for the rib section or the strip section, if you're not familiar, we're actually just taking that surface area and cutting it in half. Okay, so you're cutting a rib and a strip lengthwise right down the middle. And in traditional meat cutting, yes, that makes you wince. It's not something that makes you very comfortable, but when you do that and you have pretty much half the surface area, what can you do to the thickness? You can double it. And so we're taking what was a ribeye steak and we're making a ribeye fillet. Okay, or we're taking a strip steak, it would be a strip fillet or a Manhattan steak, for example. They're calling it a Manhattan steak. So we're making it petite due to the fact the surface areas got so large. So that's just the commentary. We don't have those cuts here, but we've got that mentality. We've essentially taken the ribeye, we've pieced out the cap. Okay, we know the cap on the ribeye, the big C muscle on a ribeye, we pieced that out. It's very tender. It's actually more tender than the top loin muscle. Okay, and we can make a nice cap steak or a cap roast out of that. Then take that muscle lengthwise, cut it, and then you can cut it into things that sort of mimic, in a way, a tenderloin. They look like a filet mignon, but they've got more marbling in the ribeye and the strip. So we take that mentality, and we're doing that up here a little bit more now. That's sort of the spirit of this value cut with the flat iron, as well as other value cuts that we've worked through. So